I walked into Grant's office on Valentine's Day with a small bakery box in one hand, a weekend envelope under my coat, and the gray wool scarf I had bought because he once said Portland winters made him feel older than he was. I was not there to catch him, test him, or prove the distance between us had turned into something uglier than work stress. I had told myself the late nights were pressure, the quiet dinners were exhaustion, and the kiss he gave me that morning still meant there was something worth saving. Then the glass doors to the employee lounge opened, and I heard applause before I saw him standing beside Brooke Adler beneath red paper hearts and cheap Valentine lights. Grant was holding a ring box in his palm, smiling like the room belonged to him, and every person clapping seemed to understand a story I had never been told. He did not say they were getting married, not in the clean, legal way, because Grant always knew how to leave himself 1 inch of denial. He took Brooke's hand and told the room she was the woman who had helped him begin again, while 200 employees applauded, like they were watching a love story reach its proper ending. Brooke covered her mouth and laughed through tears as he slid the ring onto her finger, and a woman near me whispered that it was sweet. He had found happiness after such a long separation. That sentence hurt worse than the ring, because it told me Grant had not only hidden another woman, he had buried me at work while still coming home to my bed. Brooke looked toward me with polite confusion, the kind people give someone they cannot place. And Grant finally saw me standing there with Valentine gifts in my hands. His smile broke, but he did not step away from her, did not say my name, and did not correct the lie the room had just applauded. I turned before my face could become part of his explanation, walked back through the lobby with the bakery box still warm against my ribs, and left without giving him the scene he had already written for me. I sat in my car beneath the office garage lights, with the bakery box on the passenger seat and the weekend envelope pressed flat against my purse. The gifts looked foolish now, not because they were sentimental, but because they belonged to the marriage Grant had let me keep believing in while he taught everyone else it was already over. I watched employees drift past the elevators, smiling down at their phones, probably sending messages about Brooke's ring and Grant's brave new start. What steadied me was not anger, but the proof sitting fresh in my mind. The woman near me knew about a separation. Brooke did not know my face, and my husband had kissed me goodbye before walking into that room. I called Calvin Price before I called Grant, because the first words after public humiliation can become a weapon if they land in the wrong hands. His voice changed when I told him, Grant just gave Brooke Adler a ring in front of the company, and when he asked what exactly I had seen, I gave him facts instead of grief. The ring box, the applause, the words begin again, Brooke's confusion, the employee calling it a long separation, and Grant freezing without correcting one person. Calvin told me not to text Grant, not to go back upstairs, and not to answer anything until he had sent notice to preserve documents. Then he moved quickly, withdrawing every non-essential authorization tied to my approvals, pausing joint sign-offs that required mutual review, and notifying the board that the controlling shareholder was demanding an immediate record hold. I did not destroy the company, and I did not touch what employees needed to keep working. I only took back the permissions Grant had been using like they were his birthright. Within an hour, my phone started lighting up with his name. Again and again, each call arriving faster than the apology he had not earned. By the time I pulled out of the garage, I understood why he was panicking. Love had not reached him yet. Access had. Grant showed up after dark in the same navy suit he had worn beside Brooke. But the man on my porch looked smaller than the one who had stood under Valentine lights, accepting applause. His tie was loose. His hair had fallen out of place, and before he looked fully at me, his eyes moved toward the street, as if the neighbors mattered first. I opened the door with the chain still latched, and that narrow strip of metal between us made his mouth tighten before he tried to soften his face. Avery, it was not what you think, he started, but his voice dropped when headlights passed behind him, and that nervous glance gave me the first honest thing he had shown me all day. I kept my hand on the door and asked what Brooke believed. because I already knew what I had seen and needed him to say the lie out loud. Grant rubbed both hands over his face, then admitted he had told her we had been separated for almost a year and that the divorce was only delayed because of company assets. I reminded him he had slept beside me the night before, left his laundry in our bedroom hamper, signed his mother's birthday card with me last week, and kissed me goodbye that morning before walking into a room where everyone thought I was gone. His mouth opened, but nothing useful came out, and the silence did more than his excuses because it proved every small detail in our house had been used against the truth. When he finally whispered that he meant to explain once things were stable, I understood that stable meant Brooke believing him, the company protecting him, and me staying invisible until his new story hardened. He tried to call it a private mistake, but mistakes do not come with ring boxes, office applause, and employees trained to pity a separation that never happened. I told him the person who turned our workplace into proof of his new life did not get to call the workplace innocent now. Then I closed the door slowly while his phone started ringing in his hand, and his face showed me Calvin's notices had reached him before regret did. The board meeting was called that night, not because Grant had embarrassed his wife, but because a senior officer had let a private lie enter the company's chain of command. I sat at my dining table with Calvin beside me, my laptop open, and my hands wrapped around a mug I had not touched since pouring it. Margot Penfield appeared first. Calm, in the careful way people become when the wrong tone can weaken the right question. Brooke joined from her office with no ring on her hand, and Grant came on last with his collar open, looking like applause had already started leaving him. Margot did not dress the questions in sympathy, and that made them harder for Grant to escape. Was he legally married to me? Had he told Brooke we were separated? And had he reported the relationship through the company's conflict process? Grant tried to call it a complicated personal situation. Then a misunderstanding of timing, but Margot repeated the questions until he answered yes. Yes. And no. Brooke's face changed when he admitted the relationship had never been disclosed. Not because she was hearing about the marriage for the first time, but because she understood her title had not protected her from being used. When Calvin nodded for me to speak, I kept my voice even and gave only what the record needed. I had never separated from Grant, never authorized him to describe our marriage as finished, and never allowed my name to support a relationship inside the company. No one asked how I felt, and for once I was grateful, because feelings would have given Grant a corner to point at. Margot requested a temporary lock on Grant's executive access, a preservation hold on internal records, and an independent review of approvals carrying my name. Brooke was placed on administrative leave from decisions connected to Grant, not because the board had decided she lied, but because a CEO does not get to rely on trust where disclosure is required. The first consequences did not look dramatic, yet they changed the air in the room fast enough for everyone to feel it. Grant left the meeting with his authority suspended. Brooke left with her clean image cracked, and I closed my laptop knowing the company had finally heard the truth before he could rename it again. Brooke called the next morning while I was standing in the kitchen, staring at the bakery box I had brought home unopened. Her name on my phone made my stomach tighten, not because I wanted to fight her, but because I did not yet know which part of Grant's story she had been living inside. She did not ask for forgiveness, and she did not start by defending herself, which was the first reason I stayed on the line. He showed me a lease. She breathed, and the shame in her voice was quieter than the woman who had stood under Valentine lights with a ring on her hand. Grant had told her he kept the house with me only because company assets made the divorce slow, and that he had already moved most of his life into a small apartment in the Pearl District. He had shown her emails about furniture, a lease with his name on it, and enough half-paper proof to make a lie feel responsible instead of reckless. I did not feel sorry enough for her to forget what I saw, but I understood the shape of the trap better with every word. He had not just asked Brooke to believe him. He had built props around the story until asking questions felt like doubting pain. I gave the apartment address to Calvin, and by afternoon Nolan Greer was reviewing the records Margot had ordered preserved. The first finding came back clean and cold. The apartment had not been paid from Grant's personal account, but through company expenses under a vague label tied to off-site client work. From there, Nolan found approval trails carrying my name on reimbursements, travel access, and operating permissions I did not remember signing. The room did not need thunder after that, because the evidence was worse than noise. Grant had used the company I helped build to pay for the place that proved to Brooke he had left me. Then he had used approvals carrying my name to keep that place hidden inside ordinary paperwork. The affair was no longer just an affair, and the ring was no longer the ugliest thing I had seen. Valentine's Day had not created the damage. It had only opened the door wide enough for everyone else to see where Grant had been walking for months. Nolan presented the findings 2 days later, in a meeting where nobody tried to sound surprised anymore. He did not raise his voice, and that made the documents feel heavier, because every date, login, and payment trail arrived without drama. The apartment Grant had shown Brooke appeared in company expenses under an off-site client work label, and the access records placed those entries near approvals carrying my name. Nolan laid those records beside my travel schedule, and the silence around the table changed when everyone saw the signatures appeared when I had not been there to give them. Grant leaned forward before Nolan finished, trying to pull the room back into the old rhythm where his confidence filled any gap in the facts. He called it fast-moving operations, a messy period, a company growing faster than its systems. But Nolan answered that growth does not explain a signature created from the wrong login. Margot looked at the records, then at Grant, and I watched the last part of her belief in him leave her face. He had spent years making people feel safer when he spoke, but the paperwork in front of us did not need to sound convincing. Brooke was questioned next, and she did not try to make herself smaller or cleaner than the evidence allowed. She admitted she had not reported the relationship when she should have, because Grant had told her the divorce was nearly finished, and she feared the board would judge her job through her private life. Margot told her that being misled was not the same as being part of the document problem, but a CEO could not ignore disclosure rules because love made the timing uncomfortable. Brooke nodded once, and that single nod did more for her than any speech would have. By the end of the meeting, the board terminated Grant's executive role for cause and moved the document issues to outside counsel for civil review. His unapproved access stayed locked. Brooke remained under ethics review, and the company began separating itself from the story Grant had wrapped around it. I was asked whether I intended to keep the business operating under a corrected structure, and I answered yes before Grant could look at me. He had lost the room before he lost the title, and for the first time, the difference mattered. Grant came back to the house a few days later, after the board had removed him from the rooms where his voice used to settle everything. He did not ring the bell until it became noise, and he did not stand with his shoulders squared like a man waiting to be let in. When I opened the door, I kept the chain latched, and his eyes dropped to it with a tired little nod. "I deserve that," he murmured, and I answered, "Yes, you do," because there was no kindness left in pretending the distance between us was temporary. He looked older without authority around him, not ruined in some theatrical way, just smaller, like someone who had mistaken borrowed trust for his own size. "I lost the company," he said, and the sentence came out soft enough that the old part of me almost reached for it. I did not move, because the old part of me had survived by softening facts until Grant could step around them. "No, Grant, you lost the illusion that it was yours," I answered, and his face tightened like the truth had landed, where the board vote could not. He tried to tell me he never meant for it to go that far, but nobody rents an apartment, builds a separation story, and lets a woman wear a ring at work because things accidentally drift. I asked whether he was sorry because he hurt me, or because everyone finally saw what he had been doing with my name, my silence, and my trust. For a long time, he did not answer, and the quiet between us felt different from every silence I had begged him to fill before. He looked past me into the house we had shared, but nothing in his face asked about home, only about what could no longer be fixed. "I don't know anymore," he whispered. And for the first time, he did not polish the truth before handing it to me. That honesty did not save him, but it released me from waiting for a better apology. I closed the door gently, not because I had stopped hurting, but because I finally understood that his understanding was no longer my responsibility. The divorce moved slowly, the way real divorces do, through lawyers, disclosures, property reviews, and conversations neither of us could soften with memory anymore. The prenup and ownership structure made my position clear, and Grant never tried to claim the company once the signatures and apartment records were in front of counsel. The document issues were handled separately, with repayment, civil restrictions, and agreements that kept him from stepping back into control where my name had been used. He did not vanish from society, but he lost the room he had loved most, the room that believed him before he proved anything. Brooke completed the ethics review and returned only after the board tightened disclosure rules around executive relationships. She called before accepting, and when she said, "I won't come back if it keeps his story alive," I believed she understood at least part of what had been broken. "You are not free from consequences," I told her, "but you do not have to carry every false signature he created." We never became friends. Yet, the next time I saw her in a meeting, she spoke plainly, documented everything, and did not use charm where policy belonged. I became executive chair, not CEO, because taking the biggest title was never the point. My work was to rebuild the controls Grant had treated like scenery, keep the employees protected, and put my own name back where it had always belonged. I sold the house we had shared and moved into a smaller place near the Willamette, where the kitchen stayed quiet without feeling empty. Some mornings still hurt, especially when ordinary habits reached for a person who was no longer there. But pain felt different once it stopped asking permission to leave. I did not walk away untouched, but I walked away with my future no longer arranged around a man who needed me invisible. When someone tries to turn your silence into consent, remember that peace does not need noise to matter. Avery did not leave this story whole, but she left it honest. She kept her name, her choices, and a life no one else could rewrite. Sometimes that is the beginning worth keeping.